it sort of meant where you were stuck, you know? And it's funny because there wasn't a lot to do. And even when you tried to do things like skateboard and stuff, you know, the police would take your skateboard and roll over it with their squad car and destroy it. Oh, I have a place there, and I've had a place there for some time. Joshua Tree has always been like a second home, and because there's, on the Rancho de la Luna site, there's 3 houses there, and because there is, sort of didn't make it made it unnecessary to sort of get your own place, because that's so our place, you know, together. Yeah, I mean, I've never really completely left. You kind of always end up, I don't know what it is, you just always, everyone ends up back there, you know? But you sort of, you have to leave, because if you just stayed there, it can be a little bit tough on you, you know? I think you have to kind of leave and prove to yourself that you can walk around in another town, you know, and then come back. Well, I mean, LA had a huge influence in that it painted the exact picture of what we shouldn't do. You grew up hating Los Angeles, and you know, I look back, we're almost like snobs, you know, like LA, lots of people, what, you know. I mean, the amount of times I've said, I'm from the desert, and the amount of times the other person has said, like, what does that mean, you know? And you realize it's a very singular pride. Only you were excited by it, basically, you know? But so LA, really, the influence it had was whatever LA was doing, that's what we didn't do. Yeah, the only kind of exception was SST Records had a real big influence on the desert musically, you know, because Black Flag played, you know, was one of the only bands that played in town, and they kind of were very inspiring in that it was like, oh, you can do this too. All you have to do is go ahead and start. Don't wait, you know. And so I think there's always been a real spirit there for everyone in the desert that's like, don't wait. Don't waste any time waiting for something to happen, you know. Since I was a kid, it was always the same size. It was always somewhere between 200 and 600 people. And you knew 450 of them, you know. And, you know, I remember, is that gonna be too loud for you?
No, that's all right.
All right. Because it's just changed, I'm totally training on how beautiful it is. If you sounded like somebody else, you got worse than booed. People wouldn't just say anything. So if you sounded like some other band or were too derivative, people just wouldn't even acknowledge that you were playing, which makes it the hardest audience in the world I've ever played for, because people aren't paying to see a show, and they see one every weekend, twice a weekend, you know, and so they're almost like spoiled, you know, and but if they didn't like you, they just stand there quietly. Nothing like finishing a song and hearing nothing, where you go, okay, I guess we're not that good, you know. But it makes you go back to the drawing board a lot. Well, Across the River was a really big inspiration for me, because Mario, in particular Mario, because see, Boomer, like always, he's just had this way about him his whole life, you know. He's very giving. He's always done everything for the right reason, you know, for the art of it, for the love of it, and expecting nothing, you know. Because, I mean, what I learned in the desert is if you expect anything from music, you expect too much, you know. And so, watching guys like Boomer when I was 12, 13 years old, you know, watching him play, and you know, at the time Boomer was a really big guy, you know, and I remember watching him. They played on an ice skating rink across the river. I remember thinking that Boomer was unheckleable. You couldn't heckle him, because if you didn't like it, you just walk away. But there was no way you could say, you suck. He meant it so much, and it was so real, and he sounded like him, you know, himself. Yeah. And I remember thinking that's what I want to be, is unheckleable, you know. If someone doesn't like it, I just want them to at least acknowledge that you're being this extension of yourself, you know? And when I look back now, it's, you know, I feel really lucky to have had a guy like Boomer around, you know, to have been around Boomer, because that's like kind of, it's a very philosophical point to get with music early, you know, is to like, I must be myself, you know. I cannot be someone else. You know? I think people associate it with two types of things in desert rock. With I think they associate it with kind of heavier, dirgier stuff, and then I think there's also this kind of spacious, almost Earthlings vibe too. You know, and that's kind of what I hear back from people mostly. But I honestly think that everyone's sound was carved by the outside, so everything had to function in the outside. And when you play outside, the sound doesn't bounce back off anything. So to be heavy, if you want to be heavy, you got to be really heavy, or it doesn't work, because you're not in a room where it gets like a concussion, like a giant speaker box. Instead, it just goes. And in fact, when you're playing in a canyon somewhere, if it does come back, it sucks, because it's like this bizarre slap that comes back. So as I'm saying, if you're going to be heavy, you had to be real heavy. And if you were going to be sort of ethereal, you needed to have a shit ton of reverb, you know what I mean? It needed to be almost like excessively whatever style it was in order to function outside, you know? Because there was no band like Kyuss in the desert, and that's not because we were so great, it's because no one was allowed to copy anyone. There's no bands like Unsound, Unsound is probably the one band that people that would be into desert rock music wouldn't know, but they were one of the best bands. I mean, they were a band that when Kyuss played with early on, we were like, fuck, they're better than us. And which is great, you know, because you need that challenge, you know? You need to keep setting the bar higher until no one can touch it, and not even you, you know? My family influence was like the album Run on Empty by Jackson Browne, which is all about being on tour, or Kenny Rogers, or like The Doors, Hendrix, and a lot of blues stuff, just a smattering of blues, Chuck Berry, stuff like that. And that's kind of what my folks listen to. And then, but when I've had my own choice to start buying records, there's a place called the Record Alley, and it's in a suburban mall. But I tell you, it always had the best selection of records almost in the world of all the record stores I've been to. It just had the right pieces of everything. And you know, vinyl was $6, $7. You could afford to experiment. So I just bought stuff by cover. And I happened to buy this compilation called Eastern Front, which is a live compilation of all these punk bands like Channel 3 and Battalion of Saints. And from there, I started getting into like the English Subhumans and the Misfits and Black Flag and GBH and Exploited, which all that stuff to me has hooks in it, you know? Like there's hooks in GBH. And the Subhumans went from a band that was just playing little tiny punk songs to playing, they have an album called From the Cradle to the Grave, and one side of it is all one song. So they got jammier and more experimental as they went. And so I think that had a lot to do with Kyuss too, is listening to stuff like that, you know. Mario, Boomer, as we know him, you know, or like people that know him well, Boomer is the one guy that I've always thought, you know, deserved most of the credit for everything that went on. It was his generator. You know, like all these generator parties that got sort of infamous, it was his generator. It was only one generator, you know? And I mean, so that just is, to me, a great example for where it all comes from in a way. I mean, Scott Reeder's one of the best bass players in the world, you know, and he played with Boomer and they grew up together. Alfredo is a fantastic drummer with his own style, this Devo Ramones strangeness to it, you know. But Mario had something special down to his song titles and everything, you know. Like this song is called Three-Legged Table, and I would be like, wow, it's fucking deep. And every year or so, they would change the name of their band, you know, because the music style changed. And so it gave me this impression that what was important was the fluidity of music and to not stop yourself, not censor yourself. So you don't have to ever, you can keep the floodgates open. And Boomer he's, you know, like I said, if you sounded like someone else, you got worse than made fun of, you got nothing from anybody. But he's one of the guys I've pulled a few licks from, you know, because he has such an individual style of playing guitar as well. And I mean, he was like, he'd have parties at his house. No one was able to do that shit, you know? No one had their own house at 17, 18. He did, you know? So he'd play this house and it'd be a Zappa poster and then a Black Flag poster. And it was hard for me to reconcile what that was together. But that was the span of his stuff, you know? And he was always kind to everybody and generous and encouraging too. And he always chose family first, which I think is really an amazing thing to do, because, you know, your family and friends are all you ever get that's worth anything. And he sort of, you know, I feel like he was always a few years ahead of his time. Like, to me, when grunge got big, initially I was like, Mario's been doing something down this road for 5 years, you know, before this, you know, and he ain't asking for nothing, you know, and which is kind of a silly, like, prideful way to compliment your friend, but that's where my head was at, you know, it was up my ass. So what are you gonna do? And his cousin Larry, you know, Mario was big, and Larry's like a stick skinny, and they're the same height. And so they were just this beautiful odd couple, you know. And yeah, so I would say Mario is really, to me, he's the guy that never got the credit, but really is responsible for so much of that stuff, you know. Gary's an eccentric individual, you know. You know, Gary's a really interesting guitar player. Just ask him, he'll tell you. And you know, Gary's a classic desert guy, you know. I mean, with each of these names, it's someone who is not a follower of other people. And Gary's this handsome Mexican dude that was always extremely cocky, and together with Boomer and Larry and Alfredo, it painted such a strange picture of a band, you know. I think that's even why I like bands like The Doors and shit, because it's like a jazz drummer, flamenco guitar player, an organ player, and then a poet, you know. And that strange juxtaposition of people that shouldn't be together reminds me of Boomer, and, you know. And the thing is that the music sounds nothing alike, but that's the point. It's such a strange juxtaposition of different schools of playing, you know. And I'd known Brant since I was 8 years old. He was playing drums, and I was starting to play guitar. And we kind of bonded over the fact that we both liked, you know, punk rock. He loved the Ramones, and I loved Black Flag, and we were 11 or 12 years old. And we played opposing instruments, and so it just kind of clicked. Well, Brant's a great drummer. He's always been extremely creative. And I mean, I've known Brant since I was 8 years old, you know. And we were so close as kids, and so close all the way through most of Kyuss. And then we kind of just didn't understand each other at the end. And I think when you're kids, that's a bigger deal than it really is, because that's all you know, you know. And so I think his version of history sometimes is different than mine, you know. But that sounds about right. You know, there's 3 truths, yours, mine, and what actually happened. And I think Brant's always been someone that's working. You know, if it's catching on now, it's probably long overdue, because he's always been doing stuff, always creative, you know. But Brant and I were in another band before that called Autocracy. And we used to play in garages, you know, after school. That's strange.
Why is it strange?
Because I don't reminisce very much, you know, and not for any particular reason. I just get stuck in what I'm doing at the moment, you know, and so it's interesting for me to think back because that's when I noticed that like a lot of stuff has happened over the years, you know. I mean, I'm 37, and a lot of stuff has gone on over the years, you know. When I was 12 or 13, Nick was already known as kind of like the loose cannon, you know. And he had long hair, and he was a stoner kid, and he was already getting fucked up before school, you know. He was like 14 years old. And I've done some stupid stuff and some stuff that's maybe a little bit wasn't such a good idea. But Nick has done a lot of stuff like that. Where I'm like, wow, that's just and Nick he's a real bass player. There's not a lot of people that play bass, you know. And you always know where you stand with a guy like Nick, because he doesn't bullshit. Like when we moved up to Los Angeles, we were always so tight because it took a while to understand why people talk so much about something and without doing anything, you know, because you just couldn't do that in the desert, you know. I mean, you wouldn't even say fuck you to someone. You'd get the why out. Someone would belt you in the face, you know. And it's not about fighting someone necessarily. It's just about putting your money where your mouth is, you know. And then Nick has one of the most infectious laughs of all time. And you know, Nick was kind of the one stoner dude that hung out with all us guys that weren't into metal, you know. Because he was just a little bit, you can see in his eyes when you look at him that he means business, you know. So it made sense. We just kind of clicked right away, you know. And we had another friend named Chris Cockrell. And so Nick was playing guitar, second guitar, and Chris Cockrell was playing bass. And it was about being friends, you know. He's also was always kind of a loose cannon too. Chris is somewhere between where I am and where Nick is, you know. Chris wasn't the greatest player when we were younger, but it's never really been about how good you were. He just had this sort of spirit. He was always committed, you know. He had the van that we rode around in, that we spray painted, you know. And Chris and I were really, really close. You know, we were just friends, and so when we ended up kicking Chris out of Kyuss, we labored over it for weeks, you know. Like, oh man, I can't. Because it started to become more and more about music and less about the concept of being three musketeers, you know. Because you start paying your loyalties to music, and you start saying, if we're friends, and we should still be able to be friends and go separate ways musically, but be friends anyways. That concept is kind of adult. It's because it's kind of complex. But you start heading that direction, and you know, Chris is always, I just think Chris is another one of those guys that's an individual, you know. And then Chris Cockrell knew John Garcia, and no one wanted to sing, basically. And in fact, John really didn't want to sing because he sang the first couple of rehearsals or jams in the closet, you know, because it's embarrassing when you're a kid to write lyrics down and sing them. It's tough. It's a huge thing to overcome. I mean, you're talking about kids that are 14 years old. John's the one guy that always held on to that Three Musketeers, we should play together, you know. Like John didn't understand why I wanted to leave Kyuss, or why Brant did either, you know. He was always like, why would you want to do that? And I love that about John, you know. He's always an extremely passionate guy, and like very like sensitive and also kind of crazy, you know. And And Scott is, have you ever seen Scott play bass? It's fucking insane. He's so goddamn good, it's almost bizarre. Yeah, and so he's got to be one of the rockinest bass players in the world for a rock bass player. When we lost Nick, but got Scott, the band started, and when we got Alfredo, the band started to turn into this. Me, Scott, and Fredo were like a pacemaker. It was going just click, 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 click. I always think of Alfredo as the strong, silent type. He's like a Mexican Burt Reynolds, sort of. And Alfredo had a big influence on Brant's style of playing too. Everything drum-wise that came out of Fredo was always fast with the right hand. Even if it was a slower song, it was. And the difference between and instantly you're in a lowrider. There's a whole different swing to the groove. And so Fredo, where he didn't write songs, what he did was he stamped everything with his kind of groove. He's very precise. And he had a style. It's hard for a drummer to have a sound and a style. You have to really, really have something. And he had this huge 28-inch kick drum, and he just had this style about him. And that's why it was great to get Fredo and Kyuss, too, because it was very natural. Because we couldn't play with someone that we didn't know. You have to know somebody. It can't be like, hi, I don't know you. You want to play together? It just that's not how this works. The whole time Kyuss was around, we thought we were like a punk band, basically. We thought we were this heavy version of a punk band. Sort of taking off where My War is, this kind of experimental punk shit. But everyone else thought we were heavy metal, which actually bugged the shit out of me for years because I was like, no, we're not. Well, I think, the desert rock scene was so, I'm saying this cautiously but kind of arrogantly insulated. It didn't want any attention, I mean, honestly, you couldn't have paid the bands to play. It was this source of pride, I mean, Kyuss, even when we went on tour finally and started making records and going on tour, we never had technicians ever, because we always moved our own gear. Because we're from the desert, we move our gear, So we'd play a festival in front of 75,000 people, and you're putting your own gear up, and then you finish and you turn around and start pulling it down. And it was that sort of like insulated pride, sort of, But I'd already been a part of that scene for 5 years by the time I got out of high school. I mean, by the time I got out of high school, Kyuss was 5 years old as a band, which is a long time in the lifespan of a band. I mean, the Doors were around for 4 years. And then, you know what I mean? And so I think once we got out of high school and were touring around, that's when bands like Fu Manchu started playing in the desert too. And there's always been this kind of connection between like Dana Point and Laguna, Newport, and the desert, Yeah. For whatever reason. And so Fu Manchu was this natural extension of that, Kyuss had rules. We were very almost militant about how we did what we did. I mean, we rehearsed 6-7 days a week for about 6, 7, 8 hours a day, once we were out of high school, by that time. And, we made this first recording, the first time we left town to record, and we recorded our first record with this guy, J.B. Lawrence, who did Coke commercials and things of that nature, And we showed up with, bass cabinets for guitar cabinets and bass amps for guitar amps, and tuned down. I mean, part of why we tuned down is to try to sound heavy outside, and also because I couldn't afford a tuner, and so we just tuned down to where it sounded nice, and then we tuned to each other. And I thought, this is something no one's doing, that would make us different before we even played a song. is that it would just go blur, you know. And it did. It made us sound distinctly different from the word go, you know. And but when we went to record our first record, you know, Brant and I were 16 years old, and we, you know, we got to the studio, and the engineer JB was saying, "You can't use these cabinets. You can't tune down like that. You're gonna have to tune up to E, and you're gonna have to get guitar amps. We can't do this like this." And so we kind of powwowed and talked. We came back and we said, "All right, I'll use a guitar cabinet, but I'm going to use the bass head, and we have to keep it tuned down because John sings, that's where he sings." And I think at the end of that record, our first real outing, you have recording stuff, you know, we weren't very happy with it because it didn't really sound like we sounded, you know. But we learned a great lesson that never again will we ever let somebody put their hands on what we were doing. And so it made us really militant, you know. And we had so many rules. We couldn't jam with outsiders. It was so insulated, you know. And by the time I was 21 years old, I'd been in Kyuss since I was a child. And I also was starting to listen to, you know, in Kyuss I only listened to the punk rock shit that I already had, and I refused to listen to. I didn't hear Zeppelin or even the Stooges till I was out of Kyuss. Black Sabbath, I never heard them till afterwards. And in particular, because people were like, you guys sound like Sabbath. And I'd be like, fuck them, I've never heard them. You know, it was like a source of stupid pride, you know. And but it started to feel like we were getting painted into a corner, you know. Like our music was too militant about how it had to be this way, it had to be that way. And so that's kind of why that's why I left at the end, you know, because I kind of didn't feel like playing anymore, and I felt if I was going to play, I'd want to do the opposite of that, and that's play with everybody, and play anything, you know, everything, instead of it being so militant. Because at the end of the day, if I'm going to play to somebody, I don't really want to play to a bunch of dudes. It was a very strange moment because we didn't really do anything to get signed. We just played a couple of shows outside of the desert. And that was it. And when people came to try to sign us, we were very gun shy. We thought they were trying to steal something from us, you know, and we were unsure about it. And also, all of our friends, it's funny because the reaction was like, do well, but don't do too well, you know? What I call punk rock guilt, you know? And I think that's really the only drawback to the scene was that it was so insulated. It dared everyone not to go outside of town, you know? But at the end of the day, that too is a good thing because you're forced to grow up and like overcome that shit, because that's kind of a bullshit notion, you know? That you do well, but don't do too well. You want people to enjoy it. You don't want them to not like it, you know? So, honestly, it's gotta be real or it isn't. One of the hardest things in life is to be understood, you know? And to understand somebody else. And when you get moments like that, you try to hold on to them, and they mean a lot, you know? And especially when I was a kid, when I didn't know what to say, I would go in my room and play music, and you know, I would listen to it as well, but I would play it a lot. It was a strange and kind of dangerous area in a way. You'd be at a party and there'd be a bunch of Mexican gang members on acid with shotguns, and you're 15, you know? So and then the next night it would be like, you know, pure heaven, you know? So it would run this very strange gamut, and when I didn't know what to do, I played, and that's how I understood myself. So it kind of became like a religion almost, you know? And so I think for that reason, to me, it's gotta be real for me, or I can't do it, you know? It actually, you know, it makes you wanna get sick if it feels forced, you know? And that's basically it. Now it's like a religion, you know? Because I'm not Catholic or shit like that. you know, when you're trying to carve your own path, some people get pissed off, you know? But they're only pissed off because they're walking on the path you just carved, you know? So fuck them. The Nudist colony, which if you're from out of town, you call it the Nude Bowl. And when we first started playing there, it was so fucking beautiful, man. It was just, because the walls were up, but there was no roof. And there's 2 fireplaces at each end, and you'd have a fire on both sides so you could see. And the bands would be playing, and you'd just see their shadows through the fire, you know, because they play in front of the fireplace. And people are hanging in the windows and on top of the walls like monkeys, you know. And it was just beautiful while people are skating in one of the most famous pools in America. Thrasher magazine was there. It was like, that was okay, you know, because those were technicians at what they did, you know. And it was really beautiful, but as the time went on, kind of like the scene actually, it started to crumble, and it just became, you know, a slab with no walls and just trash, with the hillside burnt, you know what I mean? And a car turned over in the roadway. And so, you know, they kept filling in the pool, but the guy who owned the backhoe was a skater, so he'd take the backhoe back up there and empty the pool again, which is pretty funny, considering he got paid to fill it up in the first place. We started by having house parties, but the police would come, and there's something about it being in a neutral location, like being in a canyon that's owned by nobody, that brings this sense of anarchy, this chaos, because there's no rules, no one's in charge. You know, you just bring your gear and play, basically, you know? And like I said, some nights it would be Mexican gang members on LSD with shotguns, and you'd be like, this fucking sucks. And then other nights, it would be amazing, like being in heaven, like where you really were in the moment, saying, this is fantastic. You know, even as someone in their teens, you know? And what was great about playing in the canyons and stuff is that the police never knew where it was. And it'd be, you know, everyone had 4-wheel drives, and you'd drive by police that were buried in the sand, trying to stop you to get you to help dig them out. And so you just roost them and drive past them, and that was before there was a helicopter out there, so you could just give them the finger and roll, you know. And there were so many memorable parties, but only memorable for reasons that are important to me, you know, that wouldn't be of note, you know. But I think other things that are of note are bands like the Earthlings, and the connection of Chris Goss and the Earthlings and Josh Homme, and because that really, when the scene died in the desert, that's where it moved to. And that was the extension of it. It's like more eclectic music without an emphasis on it's got to be heavy or it's got to be something like that. It's just got to be good, you know. And so Dave Ketching and Fred Drake, who's died now, who started the Rancho together, Rancho de la Luna. I mean, the scene is still survived because of that stuff. Well, Fred Drake wanted to move out to the desert because he had HIV, you know, and get away. I mean, you're talking about someone that was staring down death constantly, and who would take mushrooms and eat bacon and smoke. It was incredible. Like, if you were dying and you took mushrooms, if I did that, I would shit myself. I would shit in someone else's pants. I'd be so tripping, you know, like, ah. But for years and years and years, he was like the Marlboro Man, you know, just the coolest sort of creative force, and he had an opinion too. He wasn't someone that would tell you yes, he liked it when he didn't, and I love that. Because when you make music and you're trying to make it art, honesty is mandatory. You have to say how you feel. And he and Dave knew the people that came out to the Rancho, and Fred lived there and had the gear. And that was that's how they started it. And it's just a house. I mean, if you were to read a home recording book about what you shouldn't do, all that would be how Rancho is. It's a series of errors that together somehow sounds amazing. I mean, sand overtakes everything, comes in the doorway, it's in every piece of gear. You turn on something and it's like, it's dying. You know, there's keyboards there that they actually found buried in the desert. Dave tripped on a keyboard in the middle of the desert, like brought it home, plugged it in, it works. So and I think that's a great analogy for that, because you go out there and you trip on something you never would expect, and you find yourself, you know? There's no distractions, no obstructions. If someone's coming, you see them coming 15 minutes in advance. I mean, there's no, you know, you see the lights on the horizon, you know they're coming. Yeah, basically, I wanted to play in places that were esoteric, beautiful, strange, or where people never got music. So on Era Vulgaris, in the States, we played Fargo, North Dakota, instead of playing Los Angeles. We went to strange places in search of strange places, and we found out about this salt mine. And I mean, there's a bowling alley down there, and a lake, and a 200-meter slide, and all this, crazy shit. It's over 2 kilometers down. It's with one elevator. I mean, I'm claustrophobic a little bit, I was down there for 8 hours. I was like, yeah, salt burning your eyes and turning your tongue into a raisin, but it was unforgettable. There's a venue in there that seats 300 people, and we were looking for things that were unforgettable, because that's what this is trying to make a classic moment as many times as you can. And to make something classic, you have to do something classic. Mm. And this was a no-brainer. I mean, it's a shame too, because should have come out right away, but labels are quibbling over $10,000 or some bullshit like that. I'll just make something up. Yeah, when I was a young boy in primary school, my dad used to talk to me about a band called Truck Fighters. And my first reaction was, trucks shouldn't fight, because they're both trucks, they just drive together and get along. But then I realized that was really a stupid statement as I grew up, and I came to understand that Truck Fighters were not just the best band I'd ever heard, but the best band that's ever existed. Beatles, Schmeatles, Rolling Stones, Rolling Bones, Truck Fighters. That's the good shit. Where's my money?